Greetings and welcome to this week's episode of the platform Let's Talk About It. I'm your host, Jasmine Harden, and I'm here to create a space for Black minds, voices, and culture to thrive. Thank you for tuning in, and let's get into this episode. Hello. Welcome back to another episode of the platform Let's Talk About It. This is your host, Jasmine Lynn. I appreciate you for being here and sharing this space with me. I'm pretty excited about this week's episode, although it's not really that fun of a topic necessarily, but I do think it's an important conversation that should be had, especially with this episode coming out on the week of Juneteenth. Shout out to everybody who celebrated Juneteenth, and shout out to all efforts towards Black liberation. I'm full supporter of that. And I think this topic is going to come as a point of reflectiveness for a lot of people who are listening. And I'm really excited to see how this discussion develops. So let's get into it. Again, I want to thank anyone who is listening for being here with me for another episode. Or if this is your first time, welcome to the platform. Let's talk about it, where we create a space where people can be their most authentic selves. And this episode topic is, like I mentioned before, a bit of a imperative conversation, in my opinion, that needs to be had. I hope that people can take away some information from this, or just take away some points that can make them self-reflect regarding this issue or this topic. And I hope that through the process of breaking down some of these concepts, that listeners can have a better understanding of the political implications and ramifications if these types of discussions are eventually erased or eliminated from society's curriculum. And curriculum just meaning, if anyone is familiar with the critical race theory discussion in politics and in this nation's newsworthy discussions, they are trying to eliminate this theory from American curriculums and avoid institutions of learning from teaching about critical race theory. And I think that that is alarming, to say the least. So I just want to, with Juneteenth coming and with the celebration of the progressiveness of Blacks, I kind of wanted to talk about this because I think that there's a misconstrued concept or perspective around this topic. And I kind of wanted to just clarify some things. And I feel like, hey, if you walk away from this discussion and you don't agree with what I said, that is by far up to you. I'm not here to necessarily make anyone feel bad or demonize anybody's perspective on this topic. I think everybody is entitled to have their own perspectives. I just think that as someone who was educated on these types of discussions and topics and events, I think it's my duty almost to further expound upon these from a perspective of someone who is educated, as well as someone who can relate to the topics in real life. So like I previously mentioned, there is some talk on the legislative level about erasing critical race theory from school curriculum. And if you're not familiar with critical race theory or what I'm talking about, I admonish you to definitely do some investigating so that you can have a little bit more context coming into this episode. I'm going to do my best to kind of break it down, but I definitely think you should pay attention to not only this discussion, but also pay attention to the states that are heavily pushing this eradication of this type of teaching, and the state's controversial history with issues involving institutionalized and individual levels of racism. I think the simple way of putting it is that they are trying to legally whitewash history so that future generations are ignorant to the ways that racism has evolved into a much more covert issue within society today. Whereas it used to be more of an overt, in your face, undeniable, everybody knew, everybody was aware, and everybody, it was normalized. Racism was normalized. And then now it's almost as if they try to make it seem as if racism doesn't exist, and that's not true. It just wears a different mask now. Now, I have heard some arguments be made by some professionals, educational professionals, regarding this subject about critical race theory specifically only being taught to higher education or high school level curriculum or classes, and that younger children should be excluded from these types of conversations. And personally, I wholeheartedly disagree, because as a young black girl, I had to learn about racism very, very early. And because of no other reason besides it was experienced and it was in my face, and it was something of a conversation that I wasn't given the privilege of being able to be shielded or um, kept from these types of realities that we live in today and have been living in as a community for a very, very, very long time, since before this country even became this country. So I don't think it's fair that everyone else should be shielded from this reality. Um, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Why would and why should other races be protected from this harsh reality outside of any other reasoning besides privilege? And everybody in society doesn't have the luxury to benefit from that privilege. So why should we perpetuate norms on a legal level that perpetuates this idea that, okay, because white Sally, little girl, doesn't have to come to terms with the fact that her ancestors were terrible people and that they committed terrible, heinous acts. Whereas me, as little black girl Jasmine, doesn't get that privilege to think like, oh, life was just so beautiful, and the way this country came together was just this romanticized idea of manifestation and stepping away from your norm and going forth and creating your own new norm. Like that version isn't something that me as a black girl I can relate to, because that wasn't my story. That's not the story that I came from. I came from a story of oppression. I came from a story of ethnocide. I came from a story of genocide. I came from a story of institutionalized racism, and how those institutions are still to this day prevalent and still to this day affecting minorities, especially black people, in a much different way than many others in our society. And I know the way my approach to this topic may ruffle some feathers, I'm aware, but I do not like ignorance. And when I say ignorance, I mean I do not like people speaking as if they know something and they don't. That bothers me. Only because the knowledge is out there, and if you don't know, you should say you don't know, versus speaking and spreading misinformation and kind of making words and conversations meaningless because there's no grounding or substance actually being put forth. It's just opinions and theories and ideas and no substance behind it. And because I don't like that, I wanted to talk about this topic, and I want people to have knowledge so that at the very least you're not just existing in the world without an understanding of these forces that impact people's everyday experiences, and how with knowledge one could be in a better position to combat these issues such as institutionalized racism and individual racism, whether that's through advocacy, teaching others, or creating lasting solutions. I also want people to be encouraged, anyone listening, to seek knowledge and educate yourself so that when these conversations are being had on behalf of you or your community, you're able to have an informed opinion and stance on whatever that stance may be. Not saying your stance needs to necessarily be the same as myself, but I just hope that you learn the true meanings of some of the things that impact us. And I think a lot of people kind of just go with word of mouth definitions or what your perspective, even. Like, there's a lot of opinions wrapped around these topics, and very understandable. But I kind of just want to provide some context so that when these conversations are had, people have the knowledge to back up what they're saying. So let's start off with institutionalized racism versus individual racism. Because I think it's necessary to have the conversation and differentiate the two because there are different forms of racism. Okay, people, two things can exist at one time. There can be more than one version of the same thing. And that's okay. I think differentiating the two helps provide a better, well rounded conversation when these things come up. So let's start with institutionalized. Institutionalized racism is probably the one that a lot of people who are from a minority group are familiar with, but because they've experienced it to some degree or another, or witnessed other people experiencing it. But this refers to the policies, practices, and systems that produce and maintain racial inequalities in society. So, emphasis on policies, practices, and systems. So, policies include laws, legislation. Practices include culture. And systems include institutions, education, religion, you know, justice, government, um, criminal justice, all of that, policing, all of that. That's all a part of systems and practices. So that's on that level. That's the driving while black, not feeling comfortable being in certain parts of the country at certain times of the day. That's practices, sundown towns, that's all part of practices, redlining, real estate, um, all of that. Higher insurance rates for people living in certain zip codes, like all of that, all of that. All of that is a part of institutionalized racism. Um, Even the proportion of colored or BIPOC, as they say, individuals who get labeled as special needs and needing mental health and kind of being labeled um, in that way more often than kids of different races. All examples of policies, practices, and systems that produce and maintain racial inequalities. Now, institutionalized racism, is deeply entrenched in the system of this country and is often a more subconscious level of racism. It's, like I mentioned, often perpetuated through laws, policies, and practices. And studies have shown that people of color are more likely to be, this is another example. People of color are more likely to be arrested, convicted, and sentenced to longer prison terms and than their white counterparts who commit the same crimes. And this includes death row. This includes people, and we kind of had an episode about that, disparities in capital punishment. Go check that episode out. But that's another example of institutionalized racism. It statistically shows that black men, specifically, and women, are more likely to get sentenced to death row for crimes than their white counterparts. And in education, that's criminal. In education, people of color are more likely to attend underfunded schools, which has a lot to do with the redlining as well. Again, like all of these things are interconnected, and I want that to be a theme that you pick up on as I continue down this topic. But all of these systems, policies, and practices are interconnected. So where one fails, another one picks it up. You know what I mean? Like there's checks and balances to this racism stuff. Okay, don't let them fool you. So in education, people are more of color are more likely to attend underfunded schools and have lower graduation rates than their white counterpart students. And that's the summary of institutionalized racism, because that needed to be acknowledged. Individual level racism, on the other hand, is a personal belief or attitude that one's race is superior to another. I feel like that's the definition more people are familiar with, um, and especially people outside of marginalized racial communities. Um, it's a bit of a more overt approach, or just overt, just meaning out in the open. And it is often exhibited through prejudicial attitudes and behaviors. A quick example would be how it's manifested throughout discriminatory hiring practices, hate crimes, and even racial slurs. Unlike institutionalized racism, individual racism is often perpetrated, just like the title says, by individuals who hold a prejudiced attitude towards a certain group of people of color. It's important to note that institutionalized racism and individual racism are interconnected. And two things can happen at one time. Institutionalized racism creates a fertile environment and opportunities for individual racism to thrive. For example, institutionalized racism is why Black Lives Matter protests, peaceful protests, mind you, were heavily policed and heavily um, monitored by law enforcement, whereas the Capitol riots, the police literally let them into the building and were perpetrators and helpers of, and as time went on, showed that several law enforcement officers were involved with that debauchery. So that's just one example of how they're really two sides of the same coin, because a lot of those people with the January 6th riots were known to have racially discriminatory beliefs. So that's just an example in recent history of how those things can really be interconnected. Another example of this is when people of color are constantly subjected to discrimination in the criminal justice system. Um, they're more likely to internalize these experiences and develop feelings of inferiority, which is where things like colorism come into play, because colorism doesn't just pertain to people that are white. It happens within all types of racial communities. And all colorism really is the idea that darker skin is less favorable than lighter skin. That sums it up. And um, colorism is kind of a manifestation of how individual level racism can be reinforced through mindsets and perspectives such as that. This is why Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Rosewood, Florida, if you're unfamiliar, we've talked about that before on the podcast, but do your research. But that's why those situations were so important, because they are examples in history where the line between institutionalized racism and individual level racism were completely obliterated. Like, there was no line. There was the act of this is happening simultaneously. Not only are institutions clearly being racist because the government literally blew Tulsa up with government property and deputized racist individuals within that community to slaughter a community of Black people that were thriving, and used the law to protect people who committed those heinous acts. That's a perfect example of institutionalized racism, but it's also a perfect example of individual level racism, because for people within the community to be deputized by law enforcement to perpetrate acts of racism and evil, it just shows that not only were there systems in place to protect these people, but there was already a norm within those communities that was even a conversation to be brought up in the first place, for them to even think like, oh yeah, I'll be fine, I can go do this and nothing will happen to me. This is why you hear people of color oftentimes say things like, oh, Black people can't be racist because there's a level of privilege that we'll never be able to utilize. For example, in that situation with Tulsa, there's never been a time in history where people, Black people, and probably will never be, honestly. And I don't even like saying never, but there will never be a time in history where Black people can say, at least in this country, that the laws not only perpetuated and protected our racism. Like, yes, I can have a bias or a perspective towards a certain group of people, but in no way, shape, or form will these laws and policies in this country perpetuate my ability to be racist to another individual and have a privilege or an advantage over said people. So that is a tricky line for people who aren't a part of the Black community to really understand, because they don't understand how pervasive these issues are. How, when as a Black person, I see the Capitol, I see the White House, I see the judge houses, the courthouses, excuse me, I see all these institutions that make up what America is so about, and I know that my ancestors built this for white people and got nothing from it but oppression, and their generations have been suffering since they've been brought here and continue to suffer. So there's that argument of like, okay, well, yeah, I can dislike a certain race all I want to, but me disliking another race doesn't really do anything. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that perspective, but I do empathize and understand why that perspective exists. Unpopular opinion, I think that that's just not entirely true. I think white supremacists created that mindset so that we can perpetuate oppression that they created, but we can sustain it by thinking that we're above racism, or that we're not able to be racist because we have a right to be racist. Like, no, 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 no. That's not a progressive way to think. It's just not. Now, people who have that opinion, again, like I said, I empathize, I understand, but it's just not reality. And when you come to terms with that, I hope that somebody will be able to, shoot, I hope this podcast, even, you can come back to this episode or make more episodes on this topic. Of course, if you guys are interested in it, I would love to talk more about it. But come back to knowledge and know that, okay, yeah, I can feel this way, but the reality of the situation is that me being racist is not helping my own situation. It may make me feel better in the moment, even, but long term, the world that our kids are going to grow up in and things like that we're not doing them any justice by continuing to have this mindset that they literally is a part of those systems. It's a part of that institution. It's a part of the plan. The plan was to have these different races compete to be who can be the closest to whiteness in this country. And that competition has caused sub levels of discrimination, oppression, and things like that in this country. A perfect example is 9/11. After 9/11 happened, you saw people of Middle Eastern descent being targeted and put made out to be like the whole race of people were just evil and empathize with these terrorists, when in reality that's just so ignorant. And I think that's an example in modern history where people were using political standpoints or things that happen, terrorism, to allow them to perpetuate the behavior and the mindsets that affect them as well. And it was really unfortunate, but it's the truth, because it makes less work for them. Honestly, it creates less work for the white supremacists to deal with these problems when we're over here fighting amongst ourselves, keeping ourselves distracted from who's really in power and who's really the puppeteer behind all of these things, whether it's the media, whether it's the institutions, whether it's education, like all of it, family, religion, all of it, and how all of it can really be used to as a distraction from the nefarious plans, such as getting rid of critical race theory, which is going to be my next point I get into, and using things like that to warp people's minds and not live in the present and in reality of what's going on in this country. So, critical race theory is just a theoretical framework that was aimed to understand and address the ways that race and racism intersect with other forms of oppression in society, such as class, socioeconomic class, gender, and sexuality, even. And it was later expounded upon by one of my favorite sociologists, excuse me. She created a sociological theory of intersectional intersectionality. And intersectionality was something that, like, one of my favorite theories that I think I learned in undergrad. And it really, oh, I didn't even say her name, Kimberly Crenshaw. Look her up if you don't know her name. She's an amazing, brilliant woman who added something essential to understanding um, not only this topic, but just the way that individual experiences really do shape the way people show up in the world. And it was it emerged in the US around 1970s, and it has since expanded on all parts of the world. Um and the purpose of critical race theory specifically, because intersectionality was the first theory and then critical race theory came after. So definitely encourage you to do some research on intersectionality, because it's very interesting perspective and take. But critical race theory was mainly focused on challenging the idea that racism is an individual flaw or a thing that doesn't really exist anymore. It's in the past, but rather bringing light to the fact that it's pervasive and that it's deeply ingrained in features of society that operate both on the individual and institutional level. It really emphasized the importance of centering the experiences and perspectives of people in marginalized communities, people of color, in understanding and addressing racism. So, in short, in layman's terms, is really just acknowledging that in order to understand racism and understand the way that racism is embedded in this country and embedded in the experiences that we don't have a say in, quite frankly, is to listen to who is experiencing them, not the people who say, I don't understand why you guys say that. Those aren't the people we want to listen to. People we want to listen to are the people who can tell you, which is why this episode was on my heart for so long and why I felt it was important. And I hope that it really speaks to people, especially given that Juneteenth just passed. So I'm hoping like people are charged up just a little bit, to really sit with this topic. Because at the end of the day, I'm sorry, I just popped my lips like that. I don't know what came over me. But critical race theory is just important to recognize, because I think when you hear these conversations on the news, people aren't as alarmed as I would like them to be, personally. Like, I think people think like, oh, it's not going to be. If they get rid of this stuff, it's going to breed generations of young people who have no idea how pervasive some of these issues are. And they're not going to learn until it's too late. And that scares me. That scares me because I had to learn. And there are plenty of other people in society, given depending on where you like class, again, intersectionality, depending on where you grew up, depending on your sexuality, depending on your gender, all of that plays a part into why, like, the different types of experiences that you're going to have as a racial community. And to think that you can just erase that from history, like, oh no, people don't have different experiences. Like, no, the country didn't perpetuate any form of discrimination and prejudice. And no, that wasn't our doing. That was just a small speck in the history of this country, and that is not true. 400 years is not a small speck, okay? Prior to America even becoming America is not a small speck. Ask the Native Americans, okay? I'm pretty sure if you talk to the Native Americans, they will have a very different timeline of that being a small, quote unquote, speck of this country's dark, like, let's be real, very menacing and evil, even diabolical, I'll even say, history and development. So I charge you people, anyone listening, to really educate yourself on this topic, because especially if you're thinking about having kids and things like that, like, clearly the country is not, and you're a black person or a person of color, clearly the country does not want to teach them the truth. And that's been the case for a while now. But for it to be put into legislation is where it really becomes scary. It becomes a part, it's perpetuating the exact topic we were just talking about. It perpetuates the institutionalized racism. It perpetuates the ignorance that allows people to completely invalidate and eradicate the experiences of certain racial communities that are important, are American history. Like, let's be real. Black history is American history. So to sit there and say, oh, we don't want to teach them about that, we don't want to perpetuate. No, you created it. So you don't get to just say, oh, we don't talk about that anymore. Like, we don't want to talk about that. That's okay. We can just skip over that. We can just talk about slavery, and then we can go to Martin Luther King, and then we're good. And it's like, no, 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 no. No, 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 not on my watch. What Iyanla say? If I could soundbite that, I would. It's okay, y'all. We gonna upgrade. But yeah, Iyanla, not on my watch. Like, for real. Not a game. Not a game. And I don't know where that British accent just came from. But yeah, no. So I think that it's important to acknowledge that. And I hope that this topic was meaningful, interesting, thought provoking. Please give me feedback. I love hearing the feedback. And I also want to hear any differing opinions. Like, I don't want people who just agree with everything that I'm saying to respond. I love differing opinions. I think it provides opportunity for more content. And it provides an opportunity to get to know the perspectives of my listeners, like who's tapped in and who's listening and what more would you like to hear. So definitely share your thoughts with me, please. I just want to close by encouraging anybody listening to take some time, whether it's today or another day or whenever you have time, to clear your mind and really sit with the information that was presented in this episode. I want to again encourage you guys to give me questions. I welcome all questions that come as a result of you listening. Definitely document them. And reach out to me. I would love to hear your questions and create some dialogue. Allow your thoughts to freely flow, and do not internalize this information or identify with it to the point where your energy levels are now negative. That was not my intention with this at all. I hope that you're able to kind of release some of the things that came up and revisit them, even if you must, but not internalizing it and making it something that becomes a weight on your chest, or on your mind, because it's not that. That's not what this was intended to do. If you're listening to this is a sign to me that you are currently have the opportunity to invite a change in perspective and growth in your life. And if you wish to seek it, I hope that you allow the healing and learning process to exist and give yourself enough grace to experience this however you need to. Um, Always praying for my listeners. I'm praying for anyone who's listening, because I know the topic I am discussing on this episode can be a bit heavy. So, sending you my love and genuinely hoping that you walk away from this episode not only feeling informed, but motivated to either learn more, advocate more, or share these types of conversations more with people around you who you think deserve to hear it and need to hear it. I'm going to tag some of the resources I used, um, especially about intersectionality and critical race theory. I'm definitely going to tag some of those links in the show notes, so be sure to check those out. I hope that you again enjoyed your holiday weekend. I hope you did something nice for yourself. And I look forward to speaking to you again on our next episode. Has some cool topics that will be coming up. I will be taking another break in the next couple weeks, but I will give you more than a week's advance notice on when that will be taking place. But until then, I hope that you guys are well and taking care of yourselves. You are loved, you are appreciated, and you deserve to be here. As I always say when I'm closing out, stay well, stay safe, and stay you. Your presence was appreciated, and I look forward to speaking with you next time. Bye-bye. I just want to express my gratitude for you taking time out of your day to share this space with me. I hope this episode was meaningful and you leave feeling enriched. I appreciate you for being a part of this community of listeners. I hope you gain some fulfillment out of your day. Please do not forget to go follow us here and on all social media platforms. You can find us on Instagram at the platform LTAI podcast and Twitter at the platform LTAI. Also, share any episodes that you've enjoyed with loved ones. I appreciate any help getting this community to grow. Sending positivity your way, this is your host, Jasmine, signing off. Stay safe, stay well, and farewell.